Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for joining today. My name is Grant Wells. I'm Director of Innovation and Development for the Maternal and Child Health Research Institute. I'm so excited for today's seminar on scalable strategies for improving diet and mitigating climate change. Really interesting topic that both Anna and Amanda are going to bring to us today. But before we get going, just want to do some quick promos of a few things that we've got going on here at MCHRI. First, just want to thank our education committee. Really delighted to have such a diverse committee that's brings us all these wonderful topics and keeps coming up with different things to present to our robust community across the campus. Um, just want to do a plug for our next seminar on Monday, February 10th, talking about team science and translational medicine. If that's a particular interest to you, we'd love it if you could join and kind of learn about our program, but also kind of hear from Juliet and her experience. Then our upcoming seminar, and just a quick plug that this date might be in flux, but our next seminar will be on interventions for obesity. So kind of a nice tie-in to today's seminar, but really kind of focusing in on the basic side with Katrine, and then to some of the really innovative work that Tom Robinson's done in our communities. One really interesting event that's coming up is this event in honor of Betsy Mellons, who passed away suddenly last year. But the immunology of autoimmunity and antigen symposium that we have, really a wonderful group of speakers. We've got a number of folks from across the campus, as well as folks from other institutions and the NIH. So we hope you can kind of put a plug for this on your calendar. You can register on our website. It'll be hosted either in person at CAM in the Grand Rounds room or by Zoom. But without further ado, just want to turn this over to one of our education committee members, Kara Meister, to just introduce Anna and Amanda, and we'll take it from there.
Great. Thanks so much, Grant. Thanks to everyone joining in real time, and thanks to all of you who are undoubtedly accessing this recording. We're happy to have all sets of attendees. Today, I have the honor and privilege to introduce two members of the Stanford Food Policy Lab to present this timely topic on the interplay between food and climate change. Anna Grummon is an assistant professor of pediatrics and health policy. She's a behavioral scientist whose work seeks to identify and evaluate policies that encourage healthy eating and help us live long, healthy lives. She uses a variety of tools and everything from randomized trials, quasi-experimental design, and simulation to examine how food policies, labels, taxes, and programs affect how we eat. She earned her PhD and MSPH in health behavior from University of North Carolina, School of Public Health, and a BA with honors from Stanford in human biology. She completed her postdoctoral training at Harvard University, and we're lucky to have her as a faculty here. And Anna's joined today by Amanda Zeitlin. Amanda is a project coordinator for the Food Policy Lab. She supports several behavioral weight loss intervention through the Stanford Prevention Research Center. She's also a professional chef who is focused on whole food, plant-based cooking, and she spent several years as a culinary instructor through the Stanford Teaching Kitchen. She received her bachelor's from Princeton University, a master's from Columbia Teachers College, and a master's of public health from USC Keck School of Medicine. We're so honored to have Anna and Amanda here. Take it away.
Thank you so much for those lovely introductions, and thanks for having us. It's just a pleasure to join, and I see some friendly faces in the audience, so thank you all for being here with us. So as Grant and Kara mentioned, we're going to be talking today about some of our lab's work that aims to improve diet and mitigate climate change through food policies. And since we know that the MCHRI community is broad and studies many different topics and diseases, we wanted to start really big picture and tell you what motivates us to do this work, why we think it's so important. And we're going to start with some statistics. The first of which is that unhealthy diet is responsible.
Anna,
Oh, yes.
can I ask you to move to a full slide? I don't know if it's just me seeing it as the moderator or if others are
Oh,
seeing.
let me try again. Thank you. There we go.
Perfect.
Are you?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much for the tip. We appreciate it. So thinking about what motivates us to do this work, we know that unhealthy diet is responsible for 1 in 5 deaths in the US, which means that every year more than 500,000 deaths could be prevented or delayed if we had better strategies for helping Americans eat more healthfully. We also know that unfortunately progress addressing unhealthy diet has been quite slow. So what you see on the slide here are average healthy eating index scores for children and adults in the US. And healthy eating index is just a measure of overall dietary quality. It's alignment with the US dietary guidelines. And it ranges from 0 to 100, where 100 is the ideal diet. And you can see in no year in the US are we doing better than 60 out of 100 or like a D minus. The Stanford undergrads would be up in arms about this type of grade. And despite some minor improvements from 2005 to about 2012, we've actually seen some regression in the last decade or so. So this tells us that we need new strategies to address this problem of unhealthy diet. At the same time, we know that food systems are a major contributor to climate change. Together, food systems account for about 34% or 1/3 of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. And that's from a whole range of things that go into the food system, including production, processing, packaging, transportation, et cetera. So not only is food incredibly important for our health, it's also a big part of what's driving climate change. So these are population level problems causing hundreds of thousands of deaths and a huge percent of greenhouse gas emissions. And we think that population level problems really demand action also at the population level. As a lab, we're particularly motivated by the promise of public policies for addressing diet and climate change because policies can create change that is long lasting. Policies often stay in place for many decades. And they can create change that has wide reach, affecting entire cities, states, or countries where they're implemented. For those reasons, our mission as a lab is to help policymakers implement policies that improve diet, prevent disease, and mitigate climate change. Our lab, the Stanford Food Policy Lab, studies policies across a variety of areas. We study food and beverage labels. We study food assistance programs like SNAP and school meals. We study alcohol warnings, sugary drink pricing policies like taxes, and policies that aim to promote healthy, sustainable diets. As Kara mentioned, we do that using a variety of methods from randomized trials to qualitative research, quasi-experiments, and simulation models. And today we're going to dive into 2 of these research areas, some of our work on food and beverage labels and on promoting healthy, sustainable diets. And we'll show you some examples of the tools we bring to these topics. So with that background in mind, the things we're going to dive into today in our seminar is first, some studies evaluating the effects of sugary drink warnings on consumer behavior, and then some of our work to identify and encourage healthy, sustainable dietary substitutions. And I'm going to take the first half, and then I'm going to pass it to Amanda, who's going to tell you more about healthy, sustainable substitutions. So starting with sugary drink warnings. Now, I told you a few slides ago that unhealthy diet is a huge problem in the US, contributing to about 1 in 5 deaths. The question we're going to ask is a more narrow one now, which is whether warning labels could be part of a suite of strategies we use to address poor diet quality. Now, warning labels are not a new policy. This is not a new intervention. They've been required on cigarette packs for many years. And in fact, today, more than 100 countries globally require graphic or pictorial warnings on cigarette packs. We know from a large body of research that this type of warning encourages people to quit smoking and prevents young smokers from initiating smoking. More recently, we've seen policymakers become interested in applying this policy also to foods and beverages. So here in the US, 7 states, including our home state in California, have proposed policies that require health warning labels specifically for sugary drinks. So kind of narrowing in on one aspect of unhealthy diet, sugary drinks. And these policies, if they were to be implemented, would require these warning labels that describe the health harms of sugary drinks to appear on the front of product packaging. So your Coca-Cola, your Pepsi would have this little safety warning on the front that tells you that drinking beverages with added sugar contributes to diseases like obesity, type 2 diabetes, and tooth decay. These policies have not yet passed in any of these states, but they are often proposed by lawmakers and so could eventually become law. Internationally, we've seen some policies actually come into action. So 10 countries have adopted a different style of food and beverage warning that we call a high-in nutrient warning. So rather than talking about health harms, these warnings signal when products have high levels of unhealthy nutrients like saturated fat or added sugar. These are quite common now in Latin America. If you travel to Chile or Colombia or Mexico, you'll see these stop sign shaped warnings that tell you when foods are high in these nutrients. The US has started to take a page out of the international book. The FDA for the last 2 years or so has been developing similar high-in labels. They wouldn't say warning, they wouldn't have stop signs, they'd be a little bit more mellow than what Latin America has done, but they would serve a similar purpose of signaling to consumers when products are high in unhealthy nutrients. And in fact, just a couple of weeks ago, the FDA released a proposed rule to require this type of front of pack label here in the US. So it's possible that could eventually become law. Now, when thinking about these new food labels, I think it's helpful for us to consider the status quo for nutrition labeling in the US, which is the nutrition facts label. It's a label you're probably all familiar with. It's been required since the mid-90s. And it's a numeric label that's typically shown on the back or side of product packaging. Unfortunately, we know from a large body of research that most people, including people with lots of education, have trouble using and understanding this label. By contrast, warnings are shown on the front of product packaging, so we don't have to go hunting for them. They're right there as sort of mini billboards when we're deciding what to buy or eat. And rather than only showing us numbers, they provide us with interpretive information. They help interpret these numbers for us, either by talking about health effects or by telling us when a product is high in a nutrient. So we don't have to guess, is 10% saturated fat high? Is that low? I don't know. So you can see how warnings might be more effective than the status quo at providing accessible, easy to use nutrition information. All right, so despite all that interest in warning labels, and even though 7 states have proposed warnings specifically for sugary drinks, until recently, we actually didn't know whether these warnings could change consumer behavior. So this was a case where the policymaking got out a little bit ahead of the science. So our research team was interested in understanding whether sugary drink warnings could change consumer behavior, could reduce purchases of sugary drinks, which of course is the goal of the policy. To address that gap, we conducted a randomized trial in a naturalistic convenience store laboratory. So this is a lab that we set up to look and feel like a real convenience store. It sold foods and beverages and household items like Band-Aids and soap and toothpaste. You can see a picture of one of our research assistants, Carmen, setting up the store. But because it was a lab, we were able to manipulate aspects of the environment, like whether the sugary drinks had warning labels. And that is exactly what we did. We recruited 400 adults to visit us in the convenience store, and we randomized them to one of 2 trial arms, a warning label arm or a control label arm. In the warning label arm, we put these red stop sign shaped warnings in the front of all of the sugary drinks in the store. And prior to running the trial, we conducted a series of experiments to understand how to design these labels to maximize their benefits. And those studies indicated that warnings with the characteristics you see down the center of the slide, that, for example, include health effects and the marker word warning, are more effective than warnings without those characteristics. So our trial label adopted each of these features, as you can see here. And again, we put those directly on the front of the sugary drinks in the store for participants in the warning label condition. In the control label condition, we also put new labels on the front of the sugary drinks in the store, but rather than a warning label, we put this barcode image, which is just a neutral image. Barcodes already appear on product packaging, but we wanted to control for the presence of a new label on the sugary drinks in the store. So people came to the store, they saw their randomly assigned label on the sugary drinks, and then they shopped for foods and beverages and household items, and we recorded their purchases. Our primary outcome was sugary drink purchases measured in terms of calories per transaction. So how many calories from sugary drinks did people take home with them? In the control arm, participants on average purchased about 143 calories from sugary drinks. This is about the amount in a can of soda. So this is sort of a sensible mean for a convenience store. People are on average buying about a can of soda worth of sugary drinks. In the warning label arm, we see that the warning labels reduced purchases of sugary drinks by about 22% to about 110 calories per transaction. So this is early evidence, at least in the setting of a convenience store laboratory, that the warnings can have their intended effect. They can reduce purchases of sugary drinks. We also examined whether warnings had different effects across population groups that might be relevant for health equity. And the good news here is that, again, at least in this setting, we did not find differences in how warnings changed purchases by characteristics like age, race, ethnicity, education, health literacy, or income. So across those groups, the warnings seem to work equally well. We then conducted a second trial, this time with parents shopping for their children, but a similar convenience store laboratory environment. And we found very similar results where warnings reduced purchases of sugary drinks. We saw reductions of about 37% or 17 percentage points in the proportion of parents selecting a sugary drink for their child. And again, found no differences in warning effects by demographic characteristics. So we see similarly that similar results, whether we're looking at adults shopping for themselves or parents shopping for their children. Now, we might want warnings not just to create equal effects across population groups, but potentially to be especially beneficial for groups we might want to most benefit from food policy, groups that are most affected by sugary drink consumption, for example. So in some extensions of the trial work we've done, we've also tried to understand how can we design warnings so that they reach the people we really want them to reach. And one thing we have found is that adding icons to text-only warnings, so going from text about a health harm to text and an icon that communicates that text, that's good for everybody. That increases perceived message effectiveness of warnings, which is a marker for actual effectiveness. And these icons are especially good for folks that have limited English proficiency, who might not read or speak English often at home. So you can see the blue line is steeper than the orange line here. So icons are good for everybody, and they're especially beneficial for people with limited English proficiency, which suggests that these icons might have some pro-equity effects, disproportionately benefiting adults who we might want to most reach with warning policies. All right, so I just presented a lot of slides on the promise of warning labels for addressing sugary drink consumption, which of course is an important problem in the US. But I also want to paint a realistic picture of whether this policy might come to be in the US. And there's some important legal challenges that warnings are up against in this country. Specifically, warnings are considered compelled commercial speech. So they're speech that the government is forcing companies to put on their product packaging. And as such, warnings can be challenged by companies on First Amendment grounds. Now, we have warnings on alcohol and cigarettes. The government can require them. But to do so, they need to clear some hurdles, including that the warnings must be deemed factual and non-controversial and not unduly burdensome. And what we have seen is that the warning policies for food and beverages that have been passed in the US have so far not cleared these challenges. There's only been one so far. San Francisco in 2019 passed an ordinance requiring health warnings on sugary drink advertisements in the city. And their particular warning was ultimately struck down for not clearing these First Amendment challenges. Those challenges have led to a shift in policymaking in the US away from health warnings that talk about health outcomes and towards these nutrient warnings that are so popular in Latin America. As a reminder, the nutrient warnings signal when foods are high in unhealthy nutrients with words like excess or high in. And the thinking here is that it may be easier to deem these factual because you don't have to prove any health harms. You don't have to prove that sugary drinks cause type 2 diabetes. You just need to show that the product is high in the nutrient. So among advocacy groups and policymakers, we've seen a shift to these nutrient warnings. That has included the FDA proposing nutrient labels for packaged foods just a couple weeks ago. So if you're interested in this, I encourage you to check out their proposed rule, submit a public comment. But you can see that the front of pack label would look like this, and it interprets saturated fat, sodium, and added sugar levels as being high, low, or medium. And in Philadelphia and New York City, we already see these nutrient warnings have been implemented on restaurant menus. For example, Philadelphia includes sodium warnings on restaurant menus when menu items are high in, contain more than a day's worth of sodium. So nutrient warnings are gaining momentum in the US, particularly given some of the legal hurdles for health warnings. And our research group has followed suit. So we're also shifting our work to studying these warnings. And in particular, we have just run a randomized trial, and I'm sad that we don't have results to show you just yet. But we, in this last fall of 2024, conducted a large randomized trial, this time in an online naturalistic store. So rather than an in-person store, we created an e-commerce grocery store platform and had participants shop in that store. And we manipulated what labels they saw on their food. So you can see that this condition was the FDA high-end label condition. So these are some of the labels that FDA was considering. And participants shopped for foods like breakfast cereals, and we measured the healthfulness of their purchases. So we hope that that can inform some of FDA's ongoing rulemaking on this topic. We're also in the midst of evaluating New York City's added sugar warning label. So in November 2023, New York City became the first US jurisdiction to require added sugar warnings on restaurant menus. This policy will be implemented in October of this year. So they're not yet on menus, but will be soon. And we are curious to study whether these warnings reduce added sugar purchases. So we're working on a quasi-experiment at the moment that will combine information from location-based receipt and survey data with the universe of transaction data from the restaurant chain Taco Bell. And we'll use those two data sources to try to understand whether warnings actually change what people buy at these restaurants. So to summarize, this research to date has shown that sugary drink warning policies could reduce sugary drink purchases, including among parents. Our work also suggests that warnings with icons may be especially promising. And our hope is that our ongoing work can shed light on the potential for nutrient warnings specifically to change behavior and among what populations. So this first part of the talk has been all about health. You haven't heard me mention climate change at all. But you might remember from our first few slides that food systems are also a major contributor to climate change. So I'm going to shift it now to Amanda, who's going to talk about some of our work that tries to integrate health and climate. All right, Amanda.
Hi, so nice to be here today. Thanks, Anna. Great. Yeah, so I'll be talking about how we might go about encouraging healthy and sustainable dietary substitutions. Making sweeping changes is hard. You might know that from personal experience. It's about 4 weeks into the start of the new year, and some of us might be already regretting some of our New Year's goals. But in addition to anecdotal or personal experience, human behavior research also indicates that smaller, incremental changes have been shown to be more effective and longer lasting. So in terms of improving one's diet, the idea of making simple substitutions might be easier than a complete diet overhaul. And what we mean by a substitution is simply replacing one food with another while keeping all other aspects of your diet the same. And what we wanted to know was whether one swap could solve for both dietary improvement and a reduction in environmental impact of the foods we were eating. Okay. Our objectives were twofold. First, we set out to identify simple dietary substitutions that would improve environmental sustainability. That was step one. And then we wanted to determine in a quantifiable way the impact of those substitutions on dietary quality. So in other words, do the same substitutions that reduce carbon emissions also improve diet quality? And we wanted to look at that in terms of the US population as a whole, as well as by specific age groups. So how do we do this? First, we wanted to find out what people were eating. So we used data from the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey, commonly referred to as NHANES, which is a national survey designed to assess the health and nutritional status of adults and children throughout the United States. And this includes collecting data about what participants eat and drink. And the dietary data is collected through dietary recalls, which in the nutrition world are considered the gold standard of dietary measures. So on 2 non-consecutive days, people are asked to report what they ate in the previous 24 hours. And we use data from the years 2015 to 2016. And then we wanted to figure out what the environmental impact was of those foods we were all consuming. And we used a database called Data Friends, which was designed by Diego Rose, a collaborator of ours at Tulane. And this is the database of the environmental impact of foods. They use a life cycle analysis to document carbon emissions at each stage of food production, except for the transportation and packaging. But this, they are able to account for about 80% of total emissions. So, for example, this is Sally eating her breakfast, as she should be. And we can quantify the impact of what she's eating for breakfast today. So she's having an English muffin, which is 4 kilograms of carbon dioxide equivalents per 100 gram of English muffin. Her orange juice is 0.6 kilograms, strawberries 0.1, and her scrambled eggs 0.47. Thank you, Sally. And then we divided all the foods into 12 groups that the USDA uses to categorize foods. And these groups correspond to how consumers typically think about food groups. And then we ranked total carbon emissions at the food group level. And we picked the 4 top groups that had the highest carbon emissions. And those are mixed dishes, which is essentially what we think of entrees, milk and dairy, non-alcoholic beverages, and protein foods. And together, these 4 groups account for about 85% of the total dietary carbon footprint in the United States. And then within each food group, we identified about 100 specific foods that contributed most to the overall carbon footprint. We refer to these as high carbon foods. So for example, in the mixed dishes category, none of us will be particularly surprised to see things come up like burritos with meat and steak and cheese submarine sandwiches, double bacon cheeseburgers, etc. And then for each high carbon food, we identified an alternative. And we wanted to make the substitution feel as close to the original selection as possible. So for example, when finding a substitute for a burrito with meat, we didn't choose a kale salad, rather we chose a chicken burrito, which may result in a small difference in taste, but does lead to a reduction in carbon emissions. And then we chose to assume in a world in which everyone that originally ate the burrito with meat would then instead consume the low carbon substitute and eat a burrito with chicken, for example. Even this guy. And then we imagined a world in which everyone makes these substitutions permanently. So we calculated the average dietary quality before and then after the changes. And we used the Healthy Eating Index score, as Anna mentioned earlier. And then we also measured total carbon pollution before and after these changes. And here's what we found. We looked at how the dietary substitutions for each of the 4 groups affected diet quality. And we saw that for the changes made for reducing your carbon emissions by eating the low carbon foods resulted in a 4.8 increase in diet quality, measured again by the Healthy Eating Index score. For mixed dishes, 2.8 increase for milk and dairy, and 2.2 for beverages, and for protein, 2.1. And this resulted in, as you can see, anywhere from a 4 to 10% increase and all of these results were statistically significant. And here we show the reduction in carbon emissions from these swaps. We observed an 8% decrease in carbon emissions for 2 of the categories and a 50 or more % decrease for mixed dishes. So we're seeing that the swaps that we designed for carbon emissions reduced carbon emissions, but also had a meaningful effect on dietary quality. Our research that indicates that a single diet swap that is similar in culinary experience can lead to both a reduction in carbon emissions and also an improvement in dietary quality. So we found that this small changes approach could actually be valuable on both fronts. Okay, so now we have some evidence to support that simple dietary swaps can improve diet quality and reduce greenhouse gas emissions. What are we going to do about it? On the next phase of our project, we decided to focus our efforts on young adults. And we did this because young adults, and by young adults we mean the age group 18 to 29 years old, they're a crucial group to target with obesity and diabetes prevention interventions because they tend to have less healthy diets and they also experience more rapid weight gain than adults in middle and older adulthood. And we wanted to consider whether appealing to environmental sustainability could be one new strategy we use to encourage healthy diets especially among young people. And we were motivated by 3 facts. First, we know from polling data that young adults in the US are motivated by addressing climate change and promoting environmental sustainability. They rate climate change as a vital issue and they're frightened about it, and they might lead them to take action. In addition, we also know that there's substantial overlap in the types of dietary behaviors that are better for our personal health and that are more sustainable. And finally, polling data also reveals that most adults are not fully aware of the environmental impacts of their food choices. And so this actually creates an opportunity to educate consumers and potentially spur behavior change. Okay. So our next step was to examine young adults' reactions to different messages encouraging healthy, sustainable dietary substitutions. And we focused on 3 substitutions: replacing beef and pork entrees with poultry and plant-based entrees, replacing juice with whole fruit, and replacing dairy milk with non-dairy milk. Our study included 28 US adults, young adults, between the ages of 18 and 25, and more than half were female, more than half identified as white, and more than half were currently enrolled in college. We conducted 4 online focus groups with an average of 7 participants in each group, and we used Zoom, which allowed us to get a geographically diverse group of participants. And the focus groups were about 90 minutes long, and our moderator, Anna, used a semi-structured interview guide to lead the conversation. We divided the conversation into 2 parts. In part 1, we wanted to see what participants' thoughts were on these substitutions sort of more organically, so what emerged from them without being specifically prompted. So we created what we called a pitch game, where we asked each participant to convince another why we should make one of those 3 swaps. So we asked Jimmy to tell Jane why eat whole oranges instead of orange juice. Create a pitch Jane on why that would be better, without giving any more guidance. And then Jane had to pitch John on why he should drink oat milk instead of cow's milk, for example. And then everyone is asked to rate those pitches, which felt most convincing and which felt least convincing. And then in the second part of our conversation, participants were asked to view and rate the messages that we designed, that our research team designed. So the second part of the focus group, we presented these messages that we had developed, and we had 3 different sets of messages. So each set focused on one of the 3 swaps we were evaluating. One was on the beef substitutions, as you can see here. And we had another one that pertained to the dairy substitutions and another one for the juice fruit substitutions. Each set has 7 different specific types of messages geared toward this specific swap. And the themes were for us to identify the messages, so we share them with you here, but we did not share them with the participants. For example, we have one called Small Changes, Big Benefits. So that reads, replace just 1 beef dish per day for a chicken or vegetarian dish. It can reduce your carbon emissions by about 50%. It can also lower your risk of heart disease by about up to 20%. And the transcripts from the 4 focus groups were double-coded and analyzed, and our team identified several themes from our analysis. And the first one was that messages were perceived as more effective when they encouraged specific, achievable dietary changes. So one participant explains, I know lots of people would be like, I don't want to, cut out beef or pork entirely from my diet. And so that recommendation of swapping chicken for beef just like 1 day per week, I think is really reasonable and achievable goal for a lot of people. The second thing we identified was that participants like to know there were clear results from their actions. So here a participant is explaining why one message doesn't resonate with them since it isn't actually linked to a clear result or consequence for their action. I'm very data-driven and just saying greener, healthier. I don't know how I'm being more green. I don't know what part of my health I'm improving. It all sounds great, but I don't actually know what kind of an impact I'm making. Participants also preferred messages that contain statistics. They seem to add validity to the claims or messages. This participant says, I think for me, the numbers just make it more realistic. The small changes, big benefits, and warning messages, they're referring to 2 of our messages, are the 2 messages that have like the most numbers in them. The other messages are more like they're possible, this will help, but this is concrete, and that's what would convince me. In addition to those central themes, we also found that participants preferred messages that were succinct, to the point, had an overall positive tone, were more uplifting, and were personally relevant. So something they could relate to or had thought about before, felt connected to in some way. And we found that the 2 messages that were perceived as most effective were the small changes, big benefits message, which described how even incremental changes could lead to positive health and environmental effects. And the warning messages as well was really effective, which focused on the negative health and environmental impacts of their choices. So participants perceived messages to be most effective at encouraging the target dietary substitutions when they discussed specific, achievable dietary changes, linked these changes to clear consequences or results, were personally relevant, included statistics, were succinct, and had an overall positive tone. And the big benefits and warning messages really included many of these aspects that we found. And we have some very exciting next steps that Anna is going to take you through. And Anna, all yours.
Thanks, Amanda. So one of the next projects we're working on that we're excited about combines these 2 worlds that we just presented to you, our labeling health-focused work with our environmentally focused work. And in just the next couple of months, we're going to be launching a randomized trial to evaluate health and environmentally focused nudges in the context of a grocery store and see whether those nudges can improve the healthfulness of young adults' grocery purchases. So our plan is to recruit about 1,200 participants to shop in our mock online store, so that e-commerce site that we've developed to look and feel like a real online grocery store. And we'll randomize these participants to 1 of 4 conditions: a control condition in which they shop in the store as it normally is, so no intervention; a condition where they receive health-focused nudges, which will include labels and swaps, and I'll show you what that looks like in the next slide; a climate-focused nudges condition; and finally, a health and climate-focused nudges condition that combines those 2 interventions. And we'll measure the healthfulness and carbon footprint of the participants' grocery purchases. So to give you a sense of what this looks like in the health condition, here is our mock online grocery store. It's called Grocery Central, and you can see that it has different product categories. You can search. I've searched here for chicken pot pie. We've got a number of chicken pot pies for sale in the store. And all of the foods in this condition have a health or a nutrition grade that ranges from F to A. So our 3 chicken pot pies are not particularly healthy. And what will happen for participants in this condition is if they select a product to add to their cart that has a C, D, or F rating, so an unhealthy nutrition rating, we will offer them a healthier swap. So for example, if they selected this chicken pot pie with a D label, we would offer them different similar products, other chicken pot pies, other ready to eat meals that have A or B health labels. In the climate focused condition, we'll do the same, but with climate focused labels. So we're labeling all the products to provide people with more information about them, and then also suggesting healthier or lower carbon foods if they select something that is in the bottom half of our grading scale. And then again, we'll measure how healthy their purchases are and the carbon footprint of their final selections, what ends up in their basket before they check out. And our hope is that this type of intervention can be good for both health and climate, maybe especially if we combine the 2 interventions. And it all leads towards these statistics that we showed you earlier about unhealthy diet causing a large proportion of deaths in the US and food systems accounting for a large proportion of human-caused greenhouse gas emissions. So given the scale of these statistics, we hope you'll agree that it's important to continue to invest in developing new strategies to both improve climate and reduce the environmental impacts of our food choices. Thank you so much.
Well, that was excellent. Thank you, Anna and Amanda. I certainly agree that this is hugely important, both from a health standpoint and a planetary health standpoint. If anyone in the audience has questions, feel free to either unmute, raise your hand, or type it in the chat. To start us off, I have a question. How did you recruit 400 adults for your study? And like, what's the plan to get to 1,200 for the next? Can you tell us a little bit about your strategy?
Sure, yeah. So the 400 adult study was actually my dissertation. So it was a labor of love, not a labor of a lot of resources. And we kind of threw everything at the wall. So we did Craigslist recruiting. You know, many people are looking for odd jobs on Craigslist, so you can find research participants that way. We put up flyers. We did some word of mouth recruiting. We used some participant pools. A lot of it came from Craigslist. That was at the time a good source for us, but it was definitely a lot of you know, kind of almost like knocking on doors, but putting up flyers, that sort of thing. And to get to 1,200, we're actually partnering, because that study will be totally online. We're partnering with a vendor that has participants that are willing to take online studies. It's called Prolific. And so we'll recruit through them, and that will be much easier than getting people to come to an in-person lab. So that's why it's possible to get these larger sample sizes.
Amazing, amazing. You know, one of my mentors in human planetary health is Steve Luby, and he's notorious for saying, you know, what's good for the planet is generally good for people. So what are some things that we can do as individuals to really improve the sustainability of our diets and be good citizens?
Oh, what a lovely question. I mean, I think the optimism from our work is that you don't have to overhaul your life to make a difference. I think that's been a positive message that we've taken away. So I would encourage you, or those who are interested in making a change, to think about, are there small substitutions you can make that might feel really easy or sustainable for you to implement? And those changes can add up to make a big difference. So maybe that's replacing beef with chicken or plant-based protein once a week, or always at lunchtime, or maybe it's shifting away from dairy milk to not, whatever feels like accessible to you. There's a whole range of options you can take, and those can add up to a big difference. It doesn't have to be going totally vegan. You can start with these small changes.
Amazing. Looks like we have a question from the audience. Margaret, do you want to ask?
Hi, thank you. This was absolutely thrilling. Really excited about the work you're doing here at Stanford. I have two questions. One is if right now our current food system is responsible for a third of greenhouse gas emissions, you know, what is actually considered? I mean, we have to eat, right? We can't have zero, right? I don't think. So where really, like, where are we trying to go by 2050? I mean, how low can you go? And then the other question I had was on the diet swaps. You know, when you chose a chicken burrito versus a beef or a pork burrito, and how do you know? I know you know that chicken is less of a carbon emitter, you know, than other things. But how do you control for the healthfulness? Because if you look at the nutrient data on a pork burrito versus a chicken burrito, they're not necessarily healthier. So full disclosure, I'm a dietitian. So so those are my two questions. Thanks.
Oh, such good questions. Thank you. So your first question was, we can't drive emissions from food production to zero because we have to eat, which is a point well taken. I would encourage you to look up a study called the Eat Lancet report. The primary author is Walter Willett, and they outline a diet that can sort of stay within healthy bounds for both health and climate, acknowledging that, of course, we have to eat. And of course, we need protein, for example, and producing protein requires resources. And they outline diet, you know, sort of different benchmarks for how many servings per week of fish are acceptable to stay within these safe operating limits for human health and planetary health. How many servings of dairy, how many servings of fruits and vegetables, et cetera. And it, gives you an overall sense of what might work. And someone like you, a dietitian, could help, an individual client or yourself put that into practice. But I think that's like a nice resource for that big picture of what we have to eat. How do we do that in a way that is the most sustainable sort of within these limits? Your second question was, well, how do we know that the swaps we're simulating are actually going to be healthier? And the answer is we didn't. That wasn't how we approached the study, which was what was so interesting about it to us. When we were designing the swaps, our only goals were maintain culinary equivalence. So don't replace a hamburger with a salad or a steak with carrots, and to lower the carbon footprint. So we sort of combed through all of the different options and found the thing that was closest in terms of the menu item and that had lower carbon footprint. And we didn't try to find things that were necessarily healthier. And that's why it's so interesting that these swaps that were really only meant to reduce carbon footprint also on average improved dietary quality. Now, that doesn't mean that every single swap was nutritionally better, right? There might have been some that had higher saturated fat or lower protein, or pick the thing you're worried about. But on average, they were improving healthy eating index, even though we were only focused on reducing carbon footprint.
Thank you so much. I am familiar with Eat Lancet.
Amazing. So
yeah, it's it's its own guide. It's not always in sync with other governmental agencies, and so I'm very happy that our own Christopher Gardner is now on an FDA board for the new dietary guidelines. So that should be helpful both directions, I think.
Yeah, and it would be, some countries in their dietary guidelines incorporate sustainability into considerations of what to recommend folks eat. I don't think the US is quite there yet, but maybe that's a place we'll get in the future, so that, the dietary guidelines start to look more like Eat Lancet.
Thank you, Jessica, for putting the Eat Lancet link in the chat for everyone. And then just to broadcast Jessica's question, in the simulation supermarket, can you control for brand loyalty to existing high sugar sodas?
It's a great question. And it's something we think a lot about in our studies. Like, when do we want to get rid of brand loyalty and have people just focus on our labels? And when do we want that to be part of the experience? So our online supermarket that we built, we did that by scraping an existing online supermarket. So just crawling, getting all the images, the prices, the nutrition facts from a particular supermarket in the Northeast. So the products that are sold in our store are the exact same products that are sold in that store at the prices organized the way that store organizes them. So it's meant to feel just like the real thing because it's based on the real thing. And then we randomize participants to conditions. So we expect that some people will have really strong preferences for Coke or Pepsi. Some people will never drink soda at all, but that those preferences will be balanced across conditions. And so they won't bias our estimates of how our different interventions affect people on average. But such a good question, because of course people come into these studies and into the real world with strong preferences for different types of products.
I had also a similar technical question, but how do you think about alarm fatigue and in your research and when you're thinking about policies?
Yeah, it's such a great question. I think especially with labeling, I think there's a fear with labels that people habituate, they become stale, you start to ignore them, both when you're thinking about the many different labels we see across products, but also thinking about a specific warning label. Like, do people still notice the warning label on alcohol? Like, many people don't. We've had the same one for more than 30 years. So I think in terms of policy design, one solution to mitigate that concern is to mandate that warnings rotate over time. This works better with health warnings. But for example, the cigarette warnings that will soon come into effect in the US. We have a current text-only warning now, but soon there will be pictorial graphic warnings on cigarette packs in the US. And there'll be, 4, 6, or 8 different ones, and they'll rotate across packs over time. So if you go to buy a pack of cigarettes, one week you might see a lung cancer warning, the next week you might see a warning about blindness. And so that new content will hopefully help overcome some of that fatigue or staleness. Now, it's not a forever solution, right? At some point you've seen all of them, but the research suggests that does help the warnings have stronger effects over a longer period. So I think that's one answer, but the bigger picture of like alarm fatigue in general, I think is a challenging one to address because of course we're all bombarded with bad news all the time. And reminding people that, the food is unhealthy is also bad news in many situations. So yeah, I don't know how the bigger picture, I'm not sure how we get to, but at least with label design, there's a couple policy tweaks we can get to try to mitigate that problem.
Yeah, alarm fatigue for those, most of us in medicine or health. I mean, you've probably heard my WhatsApp and my phone go off even 10 times during this presentation. So it's really, information is coming at us that was very on cue at all angles. But yeah. If I just had one kind of final question, but besides the B Corp certification, are there any kind of existing food labels of environmental impact that you see mainstream? And can you talk to us about those?
Yes, there are a lot. It is not something that is like uniform or regulated. I think there's some website that tracks food eco labels, like food labels about environmental impacts. And there's like at least 150 worldwide, like different, which is not great for consumers, right? Because you don't know which to trust. Not all products have them. It's hard to compare one food label to a different food label. So they're definitely out there, but there's not a uniform system. I know that some countries internationally are thinking about adopting more uniform labels that would either provide an eco grade, so like an A, B, C, D, E. That's why we're doing that in our study, most likely based on carbon footprint, or that would provide numeric information about carbon footprint. So like this product has 1 kilogram of carbon per 100 grams of product, that type of label. But those are not mandated in any countries to my knowledge. But there's tons of voluntary systems and it's like hard. My guess is it's quite hard for consumers to wade through them. And I don't have one that I would recommend over the others. I think it's kind of the Wild West still.
Great. We are almost at time, so I would like to again thank our presenters, the MCHRI, and all of the attendees. I will volunteer Anna and Amanda to be available by email if you have questions, and you can certainly reach out to me as well. But before we go, any closing thoughts from either of our presenters?
Oh, I think we just want to thank you so much for having us and for your great questions and engagement. It's really a pleasure. I think I speak for Amanda in saying that. So thank you for having us.
Thank you all. It's really fun to be here.
Great. Appreciate all the work that you're doing and hope everyone has a productive and nice end to your January.
Thank you. Thanks all.
Bye.